So it's time to start. It's 8 a.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. London time, 5 p.m. Central time. My name is Mehdi. I'm really glad to be there to host you for this Privacy Engineering Weekly Talk series. Just for the quick story, in 2021, we made a privacy engineering conference online that gathered like 400 participants. It was great. It was on a platform called Hopin. And the second conference we wanted to do last year, we tried to use Hopin, but many of the speakers and attendees told us that actually it was a platform that was not as compliant as they expect, actually not compliant according to GDPR and even CCPA in California. So we looked for 6 months to find a better solution to organize an online event, an online conference. And the only solution we found that was really, really privacy respecting and compliant to the level we wanted was Brave Talk. So this is why we're on a Brave Talk today. Don't hesitate to mute yourself or mute your video to keep some bandwidth, and of course respect the speakers when he's speaking. So one thing I would like to share with you before we start. So if you want to know more about the privacy engineering series, you can go, if you see my screen, you can go on privacyengineercon.com. So Privacy Engineer Con, you will be able to see to register, to get the news, the next speakers and the format. And also, if you're really interested about the privacy tech landscape, we gather the 1,000 top companies on privacy engineering into different categories like privacy engineering tools, consent manager, data subject access request. And you can click on whatever company here and get some lot of infos about what they're doing. And if you click again, we gather as much as we can infos for the funding, the management, the categories and stuff, the revenues when we see it. So don't hesitate to add your tool or look for other tools. All the data is open and available to everyone to make the privacy tech landscape more known. But let's be back now. We're more people here to have our guest Nishant Bhajaria, who is the author of Data Privacy, a runbook for engineers, and we share with us like how to implement privacy in real life. Hello, Nishant. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me here. I love this talk. I love the audience. So thank you again for having me here.
Yeah, I hope we will enjoy it. I will mute myself, cut my video, so all the bandwidth is for you.
Awesome. So let me start sharing my deck real quick with the tool here. I didn't want to jump the gun there. Can you see my screen now, Mehdi?
Yes, we can see your screen. If you can go slideshow, that would
Yes.
be perfect. Yes,
So,
we're good. Let's go for 20 minutes. Thank you, Nishant, very much.
this is all content that has come from a book, but I've tried to make it happen in a way that people have definitive takeaways, and then you can decide based on my talk which section of the book you want to focus on in your own time. So, and if people have questions, I can't see everybody's video in the presentation mode right now. So if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me because I tend to be pretty, into it when I talk. So I may not be able to know if somebody has questions. So with that being said, I'm going to pretend for a second that everybody on this call is partly an engineer, partly somebody at the board level, partly somebody at the management level. So I'm going to keep this talk for as many people as possible, and then I'll see if people have questions. So my career began in this domain about a decade ago when privacy, security, engineering were not a big deal, or they were done by the central IT team. And in the years that have passed since, multiple things have happened. The amount of data has grown, companies have grown, the volume of transactions has grown, the money in this space has grown. But along with all of that has also grown the legal scrutiny upon companies as well. So this screen is already outdated because I'm sure somebody somewhere is thinking about a new privacy law. But this is what I try to show C-level stakeholders and board level stakeholders about why you have to do data protection from a risk and compliance perspective to start with. I'm not saying the only reason to look at privacy and security is compliance, but it helps people to understand that this is a global phenomenon. And one sign of your company doing well from a growth perspective is that you become subject to these laws. So that's what this slide talks about. So not so much for the preciseness of the law, but more in terms of the scale and the spread of the laws. And this could be any company's name out here. So I'm going to use Amazon's name simply because they're so huge and so influential. And they have every business you can imagine, going from retail to ads to streaming to what have you. So, and of course, AWS. So for Amazon to say they don't know where they have data and who has it for what purpose is a pretty significant statement, because if that's what Amazon says, you can only imagine what companies that are like Amazon in terms of data but don't have Amazon's resources or their leadership principles could talk about, right? So this is again a cautionary tale here. So I like to show this slide simply because people don't appreciate how complex the data landscape is. If you think about the bottom-up engineering that happens in a lot of companies in the US and all over the world, and also legacy companies that essentially migrate from one platform to the other, or companies that grew because of mergers and acquisitions, the story is largely the same. Data comes into the company, and you can regulate data at a certain point down the road. But before you get to that point, that data gets into operational stores, archival stores, cloud stores, and then heaven forbid on employees' laptops, Slack channels, you know, Zoom invites and what have you. So that data pretty much gets everywhere. It's a bit like water on the West Coast in Seattle, if you will. There's water everywhere, so it's very hard to regulate something that you don't have control over. And I'll draw a straight line from this slide to the Amazon slide we talked about before. So in the book, I talk about all of this in the first two chapters, where I give you a sense of the macroeconomic changes that have taken place in the last 15, 20 years and how that brings us to this moment. Interestingly, when I was an engineer back in the day at Intel, I had very little control over my destiny. The central IT security team dictated everything, what we could collect, where we could store it, things like that. And now it's totally different. So along with innovation growth, along with engagement growth, we've also seen a significant growth in terms of the data spread and the risk that comes with it. So the straight line between those global laws I talked about in the first slide, the Amazon headline in the second slide, and the spread of data in the third slide. Any questions? So, as if the volume and spread was not concerning enough, that data essentially ends up in several data stores, hundreds of thousands of tables, and hundreds of millions of files. So, you cannot delete or discover your way out of this problem, is kind of my hypothesis. Privacy begins not with tools that address privacy risks, but that prevent risks from the very beginning itself. So, this is my favorite slide, and this is often a pretty highly resource slide in my book. So when people send me feedback for my book on Amazon or on LinkedIn, they reference this concept as something that helped them make the case for privacy engineering within their companies. So what typically happens is, if you think about data entering the company from left to right, think of the left as the edge API layer, which is the ingest point for the company. When you type netflix.com, or when you open the Pinterest app, or you open the Uber Eats app, that's the left hand side, the point of collection. And once data goes from left to right, you accumulate more and more data. And this could be additional collection of data, copies of the data you already collected, inferences from that data, joining the data with third party information. So, as an example, I'm the only person in the US with the first name Nishant and last name Bhajaria. And I know that because when I was being naturalized as a US citizen, the FBI said that to me. And that is bad enough, because in terms of privacy, if you put my first name and last name online, everything you get is pretty much me, unless somebody made up fake content about me. So if you join my name to anything on Google, you could find a lot of information about me. So when we go from left to right, that growth in metadata, that growth in inference data, that growth in derivative third party data is pretty significant. And then what companies typically do is they try to balance things out by saying that from the left hand side, the point of creation, to the right hand side, the end of the triangle vertex here, engineers can do what they want to with the data. And then once data enters the warehouse, we will do classification, inventory governance, policy enforcement, deletion, encryption, etc. And that may have been okay maybe 10 years ago. In fact, even 10 years ago, it was not okay because the data sizes were already growing. But what happens now is a lot of inferences are done between this left spectrum and the right spectrum, which means essentially when you end up on the right hand side, you are enforcing privacy controls after the data has already been used multiple times over, not to mention the number of engineers that may have downloaded copies of this data to their warehouse. So the hypothesis here is that if you go from left to right, you want to shift left as much as possible. So the phrase shift left has become a pretty big deal, just like the phrase governance in the industry. But this is what really happens behind the scenes. The reason we need to shift left is because we want to make sure that we do it while there is some control left in us. Because if you wait for the far right hand side, by that point the data will have grown a lot. And also, because the size of data grows, you will be using a ton of compute power to enforce policies that will be hard to enforce to begin with, because you don't know what the data is to begin with. So the size of your weapons has shrunk, and the size of the threat has grown, so you essentially get hurt twice over. I just made the case with this slide about why governance on the far right makes it very hard. And it hurts the business as well, because when you have collected too much data or more data than you know you need, the quality of data is not that great. The storage costs run pretty high, and you're wasting computer resources. I was advising a company a few weeks ago, and they discovered that their security and privacy teams are trying to clean up data in the Hadoop warehouse, and they could not do so because their queries were timing out. A, because the volume of data was too high, but B, they were competing with machine learning experts in the business to get access to the data. You essentially have the people monetizing the data competing for bandwidth with the people trying to protect the data. And as a business, you have to now choose, Are you going to side with the ML folks, or are you going to side with the security folks? And that's a choice nobody should have to make. Like if you are having to choose between keeping the business running or keeping your customers safe, you have already failed, because any side you let down is going to hurt your business overall. So my hypothesis is, let's shrink the size of the funnel. You cannot shrink it from left to right, because that's your business essentially. Like without your business, there is no privacy, there is no security. My hypothesis is, the moment data enters your company at the point of collection, immediately try and classify that, immediately apply inventory tags, immediately scan the code, and get as much AI intelligence around security and privacy as possible. What that basically means is that by the time the data gets to the right hand side, you will be able to progressively and continually apply policies to it, which means if you identify data that was collected without consent, for example, if you identify data that is old, if you identify data that is incorrect. As an example, if you are collecting data from customers in, let's say, Germany, and you have a bunch of people who are in Austria, and just because of the API and the CDN locations, some of the Austrian data is in your system, you can delete that data. So what happens is, when you get to the right hand size, the amount of data you have in the warehouse will shrink, but you will have good data, the right data, the quality data, the data that you care about, and you won't end up in a situation where you run out of compute power, run out of memory, compete over compute power with, between the security and the ML team. So the goal is to have categorization and governance happen at both ends of the spectrum. But because the size of data will meaningfully shrink, what you lose in terms of latency at the beginning initially, you will make up for in terms of quality at the tail end, not just for privacy and security, but for the business as a whole. So this is kind of the new model. I'm saying shift, stay right and shift left. So it's a slight amendment to the shift left verbiage that people throw around these days. And essentially, your role is going to be to identify people who can do these different things. So at the very beginning of the collection process, you want to identify who owns what, who owns the data that is being collected, who owns the services that are collecting the data. And then you assign responsibilities for ownership and transparency. You create responsibility for ingestion minimization. You make sure that there is retention and purposeful usage and overall protection of the data. So the only way you can do this is by identifying what you have and when you have it at the beginning of the pipeline. So I can draw a straight line between this. I'm just going to jump around a little bit. As I said before, I can draw a straight line between this slide, this slide, and of course, all of the collection that's happening here in this slide. So all of these 5 slides in the beginning talk about the suboptimal status quo. And what I'm pitching here is, this slide should be essentially simplifying your collection process. So instead of having those 5, 6 slides in the beginning, if you do it right, this is essentially what you end up with. So complying with GDPR, complying with CCPA, complying with Safe Harbor, or whatever regulation you're talking about, especially in the US here, where you have like different states competing with different privacy laws right here, you could simplify things a whole lot by creating an internal abstraction via this slide. I'm not guaranteeing for a second that shrinking the funnel is going to guarantee compliance. But when you file your taxes, if you have to use 4 different tax preparation softwares, it would be extremely difficult for you to scale, right? So what I'm essentially saying is, rather than having to deal with categorization at the tail end of the process with multiple risks piling up, why not do it this way? That's kind of this is essentially what the book is about. How you do the enforcement, how you do the identification, how you scale things, how you get board.
I think he got disconnected.
Yep. Yeah, Nishant, did you disconnect? Okay, waiting for Nishant maybe to be back. Don't hesitate you can ask question on the chat, right on the open chat here. You can see everyone has the ability to ask a question so far. We'll see if Nishant is able to reconnect. At least BravTalk is easy to reconnect to, so it should be fine, but that's the consequence of live, right?
Yes, I think he's back.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. You can reshare your screen.
I'm not sure that I was speaking and suddenly the mic just went off.
No worries.
Okay, let me reshare my screen 1 second. I'll need to turn off the slideshow on the screen to share it. Can you see my screen now? I'll start slideshow once you confirm.
Yeah, we can see your screen now. Perfect.
So was I at this slide when the disconnect happened?
You were before this slide. You were right before.
Okay, so these roles are critical because they identify who does what. So one of the challenges for privacy and security has been that everybody in the company owns their tools. Like multiple engineering teams, they own their OKRs, their KPIs, their dashboards, their deployment pipelines. And this independence has been great from an innovation perspective. But unless you have some level of centralization and control and enforcement, privacy and security and governance will not work. You cannot have privacy be a shared problem. Again, it has to be a shared responsibility, but there has to be some central automated resource that controls the enforcement and works with teams on an individual basis to come up with any bespoke solutions that may need to happen. So the vision I have is, let's assume you work for a company like, say, Netflix or Meta or something, a large growing company, tons of engagement, tons of customers. You want to make sure that as much as possible, your internal customers, that is engineers, data scientists, PMs, etc., they have one API that they can call, and based on that API call, they are given the option of different privacy and security tools that can essentially work on their data store. So if they call one of my APIs, they can identify what data they have. They will get a risk assessment. They will get an assessment of the categorization of data. They will understand what policies need to be enforced, and they will understand what their risk to reward ratio is. So this is just one example, but if you can have that shrunken data space and multiple automated tools, you can create a central API that will drive enforcement across the board. Because remember, your real customers are not just the customers on the outside whose data you are protecting. Your additional customers are the engineers within the company who collect the data. Like, your role as a privacy security expert is to connect the internal engineering KPI growth engagement metrics with the customer trust metrics. And if you do that, my sense is you will make a lot of progress towards meeting the requirements of GDPR, CPRA, whatever law. A lot of companies make the mistake where they start with GDPR and they think that GDPR is bad because it is not prescriptive enough. And then they complain that GDPR never seems to end. My approach is the exact opposite. Start with the engineering solution, consolidate the data volume you have, consolidate the privacy security tools you have, and then measure the improvement and then test for samples for enforcement. That will help to make sure that you have more accurate, more scalable privacy enforcement. At the same time, you will not slow the business down unnecessarily, because the fail mode for you would be the business gets pissed off. The people are going to find a way to work around privacy controls. You will end up with attorneys who feel that they are taking on too much risk, and the business that will complain that they're being slowed down by privacy. So privacy being seen as a blocker is the worst thing that could happen to you, because from that point forward, every other privacy harm will just get much, much bigger. So I'm going to leave this slide on the screen for about 5 seconds for you to absorb exactly the vision that this represents. Okay, and this is something I use for the board of directors, for people that are non-technical. And I'll basically say that when you look at the top left and right, if you look at that spectrum there, those requirements and the penalties essentially map to GDPR, CCPA, CPRA, etc. But if you look at the actual requirements, from deletion rights to access rights to minimization to legal basis for processing, these are all things that companies should be doing anyways, because unless you do these things, your ability to have maturity in your platform, to scale your business, to have predictable release cycles, to have customer facing tools that are good, they're all compromised. So I'm trying to separate this dichotomy between security and privacy on the one side and the business on the other. I like to tell people good privacy is good business. So don't sell privacy within your company as something that is purely the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do ethically and morally, but it is also important for the business, because companies that have done well from a privacy perspective have been able to do well in multiple economic cycles, have great products that go out the door in time. If you look at this story Microsoft has in the US, and if you look at the story I've pushed here at Uber in my own current capacity in the last 4 years, we have tried to conjoin the idea of sound privacy and sound governance and successful business at the same time. So that is, in a nutshell, my quick deck. I'm happy to sort of stop the presentation now and talk to people face to face, unless people have specific questions about slide itself.
Yeah. Thank you, Nishant, for I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, thank you, Nishant, for this. Again, for everyone, you can ask questions directly in the chat. I would ask a first question. You talk about governance. Like, there is a huge gap between today the lawyer side, lawyers, data protection officers, and legal counsels, and engineers. Right, there's a huge gap, and they don't speak the same language. So, would you advise a governance which is, let's say, legal driven, like DPO driven, or engineering driven, or is there anything between both that you've been able to implement?
So I tend to be very creative when it comes to the governance model, because it varies by company. Every company likes to say they're different, and they are, because everybody has their own kind of creativity and their own type of dysfunction. So whether your governance is driven by the DPO or the CPO on the one side versus engineering, security, IT on the other side is the second question. the first question is, how do you create that overlap? How do you make sure that there is some shared vocabulary, right? That I think is a much bigger problem. And when you, Mehdi, when you mentioned that attorneys and engineers don't speak the same language, that's a huge problem. Because when I've been to Paris a couple of times now, and I find out that I can get by enough by knowing what to order off the menu. But if I want to find all the cool neighborhoods, when I want to find out all the small, amazing antique shops that are hidden all over Paris, I need to really speak the language and understand the language. So I feel like that overlap is pretty critical. So as an example, when we do privacy reviews at Uber, we don't just do privacy reviews or PIAs or DPIAs. What I do is I have engineers in my team, they're architects, they're industry experts, but they're also solid engineers. So what they do is they work and they train the legal team to make sure that the legal team understands how the tech stack actually works, how engineers have to deal with different technologies and things like that, right? So how do you make sure that those overlaps actually happen? So what I have the engineers do is learn from the attorneys and teach the attorneys at the same time. So you have sort of that shared language. And then my privacy engineering architects talk to engineers across the company in terms of people that are building high engagement tools, people that are building ad platforms, people that are setting data egress APIs. And what we do is we coach these engineering teams across the company to build things correctly from the get-go. And then wherever possible, we build solutions for them. So my engineering team then builds solutions. So think about it this way: my architects and the attorneys educate each other, and then my architects then talk to the company, different teams influence their roadmaps, identify gaps, and then my team builds solutions. So governance is a continuous process, and then the DPOs and the CPOs and the CISO can collectively get together and decide a governance strategy and then tweak it as we go along. But that strategy begins with shared work, shared language, shared connections, and continuously shared risks, if you will. And the legal team now knows what to expect a month from now. Because remember, if you are a legal team and you get a sudden flurry of tools and your only choice is to block or release, your governance has already failed. My job and my team's job is to build solutions and give the legal team a heads up that risk is coming and mitigate as much of the risk as possible at the very early stage. So it's not something you would find in any textbook except for my own. It's not something that you will find written in GDPR or CCPA, but the goal is to develop a truly agile, modern privacy DPA strategy that really works for the business as a whole.
Yeah, and again, to all attendees here, don't hesitate to ask questions. If you don't, I will. There is one thing in your book. So I show the book again for everyone, Data Privacy Runbook for Engineers. You have a kind of a strong warning for third-party like privacy management tools, right? And it seems that you advocate, if I'm not wrong, you advocate the ability to build your own solutions, or at least to make privacy engineering your own practice versus depending too much on tools. Am I correct?
I think the second interpretation is correct. I'm not bearish on third party solutions. I actually advised a couple of startups that are building, I think, are promising third party solutions. What I would say is, for a lot of companies, you know how there are different stages of grief, from denial to acceptance. There are multiple stages of acceptance when it comes to privacy security risk. So companies go from saying, "Oh, this could never happen to us," or B, everybody else is doing it. C, it's too late. D, to, oh my goodness, we're host. So as people travel that spectrum, sometimes the first thing people do is, okay, let's buy a third party solution, because they believe that having one throat to choke, one solution will take care of it. Like if there's a leak in your roof, you call somebody to fix it. If there's a plumbing issue, you call somebody to fix it. And you hope that one person will take care of it for you. Privacy and security are inherently very different. Expecting one tool or one team to fix a problem that has been years in the making is simply not practical. So what I'm asking people in my book to do is educate homegrown engineers first, have them tell you what the problem spots are, identify what you can build in house, do proofs of concept with third party solutions, and that entire process will create a more informed internal workforce. It will create a more educated, more aligned internal employee base, engineering and non engineering, privacy and non privacy. And then from that point forward, you will have a better understanding of your stack for the first time in your life. Because remember, Amazon saying at the end of the day that they do not know where their data is a huge problem, because Amazon stores how many billions of workloads for all of us all over the world. And if they don't know, with their intelligence and their resources, and some of the smartest people I know in this industry work at Amazon. So for them to say that is a pretty huge deal. So my solution is, teach yourself first, but rather than teaching yourself abstract principles like we do the right thing and privacy is important, educate your engineers, educate your attorneys, educate your non-privacy experts, and then from that educated, informed perspective, assess what you can build in house and what you can procure from third parties. Don't be in a rush to have a third party solution. At the same time, don't expect that internal engineers will fix it for you end to end. This is a change in how you do business. I would compare this change to what Intel went through in the 80s when they made that paradigm shift from memory to processing. When we made the change in the late 2000 or early 2000s from waterfall to agile, and the shift from voice to data. There have been these huge shifts that have taken place. This shift in how you do governance is in that league. People may not know it right now, but it's in that league right now.
Yeah, we have some questions, an overflow of question actually, from Adam. How to make privacy a business advantage rather than a legal constraint?
So I try to find people who are hurting. So let me give you two examples. In any company right now, there are two people who will definitively have shared complaints with privacy for very different reasons, but the same complaints. When you talk about excessive volume of data, that concern is shared, but not by not just the privacy and security teams, but by the platform teams who have to keep the warehouse up and running. They have to keep the APIs running. They're accountable for latencies. They're accountable for replication of data. They're accountable for business availability. So when you apply right sizing and legal process basis for processing, and to make sure that the data size is more manageable, that is a concern that is shared not just by the privacy security team, but by the platform team. So I've often seen those platform teams make the case for me without using the word privacy. For me, the goal is to make privacy supported and get the right attention. It is totally okay if the person making the case for it is not. For a change, it'd be nice if the privacy guy is not asking for resources. The second way to make it a competitive advantage is to talk to the ML AI team. These people need one thing: they need good quality, fresh data. And privacy also wants the same thing. We do not want old, risk laden data to hurt the business and hurt the risk at the same time, right? So, finding people who share your concerns is going to make privacy a competitive differentiator, and it will give you the support you need without going to engineers again and again, creating this perception that privacy is here to slow the business down.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have another question from Harvey. How do you embed privacy engineering into the SDLC, or for people who don't know, software development lifecycle?
Absolutely everywhere. And I do this again with the earlier example with the working with the legal team to preempt the consulting process and not depend upon the the PIA process. My team also builds solutions and tools that are available widely via API to the company all over the board. This is multiple companies I work for. And finally, we also make sure that we embed other tools for privacy as well. So as an example, if you build an encryption tools to do access management, that is purely for security purposes in some cases, but I have no shame about repurposing those tools and using extending the security use case to privacy as well. So my goal would be to embed privacy across the SDLC. Remember, you have to take security training, sexual harassment training, you have to take anti-bribery training when you join a company, right? And there are multiple checks and balances for that. So why not embed privacy all across the board? In fact, by embedding privacy across the SDLC, you're reducing the risk at the end of the business, and you're reducing the burden on the attorneys, and taking what was historically seen as a compliance legal concept only, which is privacy, and making it a software solution process, which is, I think, in the end, how we will scale and achieve meaningful privacy security for the company.
Yes, and if I may, I would advise dataprotocol.com, a platform that gives the engineers kind of privacy engineering certification, and I think you're one of the master class there. If you allow me, Nishant.
Yeah, if you Google my name and data protocol, so I'll say there are three resources I can make available. There's obviously the book that Mehdi has been so generous to share a couple of times now. I teach multiple privacy, security, engineering courses on LinkedIn Learning, so you can look me up on those courses. And of course, the data protocol certification is a lot more hands-on, where you can write real code and learn real time. It's 8 hours of fairly intense learning. So for people of all levels, I have multiple resources available across the board.
So to continue on the SDLC, either like a quality assurance gate specifically. This is the second part of the question. Either.
Yeah, so I would say the QA assurance criteria should be fairly deterministic. So one example would be, let's assume you're building an API to egress data from the company for ads or for regulation or for whatever reason. How about making sure that the identification risk is quantified? So what my team does is we build software to ensure what is the re-identification risk for this particular cohort of users. Do we use K anonymity? Do we use L diversity? Should we add more perturbation or noise? So having those sorts of quality control checks across the board as early and as often as possible will help, because what you want to do is run these in the background. So if the engineers are doing something wrong, you can alert them right away. But what you don't want to do is piss off multiple engineers by creating fake process that they have to go through, and make it in the background, make it automated, embed them across the SDLC.
Yeah, a question from Bianca. What's the role of the privacy law expert, the legal expert, in your ideal chain of data processing within a company?
Their job is to enforce the governance tooling. So I want my tools that my teams build to reflect the legal team's interpretation of the law and risk appetite. That's the job. Okay. The legal team's job is to understand enough of engineering to guide us, help us build the right things, identify creative possible solutions to fix privacy issues that do not involve cosmetic fixes that don't really make a difference, right? So their job is to be a partner, not just the enforcer. I see the legal team as being a key ally, a key partner, and an important component of the overall governance strategy. Because if you have a solution that is too engineering heavy, but the legal team is left behind, you have compliance risk. If you have a solution that is purely legal based but does not have automation, you have a compliance solution but an efficiency risk. So you want to fix for both business efficiency as well as compliance and trust at the same time.
Can I further precise my question, Nishant?
Please.
What do you think is easier for lawyers to learn a little bit more of tech or for clinicians to learn a little bit of law?
So I am a cockeyed optimist. I believe anybody can learn anything except for swimming. I can't learn to swim, but except for that, everybody can learn everything. And I would say that spot, that mechanism you put into place to have engineers learn a bit about the law and the attorneys learn a bit about the tech stack, it's a bit like working out. The first 10 minutes when your body is stiff are not great, but as your muscles get looser, as your rhythm gets built, as you feel the endorphin rush, as you wave at people passing by, and you have that fresh, and then your confidence spikes up. What you are doing is not just educating engineers about the law and attorneys about the engineering, you are improving team culture. Remember, we were told for the last 15 years, engineers, sit over there, write great code, nobody's going to bother you. Attorneys, sit over here, keep the business safe. We have told a whole generation of technologists and attorneys to not talk to each other. People say social distancing began with COVID. I say mental distancing began 10, 15 years ago. So I think both of these sides can learn from each other. But the very process of realizing that both sides need to learn from each other is itself a cultural leap. And I would say different companies will have different levels of comfort with this. But starting this process, understanding the risk, understanding the solution space is a victory in and of itself. So how deeply you can teach each other is something that only you know. But I would recommend making that investment because it will make your business a lot more successful. Because remember, my goal at the end of the day is I do not want the business to be surprised at the last minute, nor do I want my customers to be surprised at the last minute. My dad is on uses every app, so I work for Netflix, Google, and Uber. My parents use all of those apps. So when I think about security and privacy, I think about, are we doing the right thing to protect my dad and my mom, and your dad and your mom, and all of our parents, our nephews, our nieces, our kids. So having a sensibility that makes this a collaborative process makes it easier for us to do the right thing for the business and the customers at the same time.
Yeah, thank you. Then a question from Henry: how do you adapt quickly to legal evolution concerning data privacy and compliance? All these regulations in so many countries and their evolution. Like, how can you quickly adapt to that?
So by taking the risk off the legal team with the PIA process, by building more automation, the legal team can learn from the engineers how the risk got created, how it can be mitigated. What that means is the legal team can always keep an eye out for any new laws that are coming up, and they can continuously update the governance requirements, which means I can now apply them to in my existing tool base, which means my architects can look for risks for this new regime when they talk to engineers on the further left part of the bloodstream. So I think of adoption of new legal requirements not as a brand new challenge. I see this as a continuum of something we have to do on an ongoing basis. And once you train, to Bianca's excellent question, once you train attorneys and engineers to collaborate with each other on the privacy security side, dealing with these new changes becomes a lot easier. Think of it this way: if the tax law changes, do you suddenly get a new job? No, you don't change your life because the tax law changed. What you do is you adapt your investments, you adapt your charitable giving, you adapt your expenses, right? So having a trained workforce, an engaged workforce, a continually connected workforce is pretty critical because that'll help you adapt to these legal changes. And at one point, you may be in the situation where if you understand how these laws actually work from a practical perspective, you can write blogs, you can talk to these regulators and inform how their legal process works as well. What we did as engineers 10, 15 years ago with open source, it has fundamentally changed how people build software. Like when Netflix released Asgard and Spinnaker, it changed how people deploy software. If we can do it within the tech community, surely we can do it for the tech community at large in working with the regulators rather than thinking of them as enemies, right? So attorneys and engineers working within the company, and those attorneys and engineers then working together to influence the regulators to build more germane, sensible, and enforceable laws is the way to go here.
But then, what is your single source of truth? Like the governance document that enable to be the source for every, let's say, legal compliance that needs to be applied. Like, do you use any or?
So I would say there is a single evolving source of truth. There is a single source of truth, but I would call it the single in progress source of truth. The truth keeps on changing here, and we keep getting new laws, not because the laws are inherently bad, but because the risk landscape keeps changing. More and more, 1 billion people are now getting on the internet that have never got on the internet before. And then there are people like my dad who thought the phone was just a way to make calls. He's getting on the phone. He sends me WhatsApp messages every single day because in his mind, I'm still a college student. He sends me a gift coupon to buy groceries at a $10 discount. So there are people getting on the internet every single day. There are new technologies, new ML learning tools, new technologies coming up every single day. So there is not going to be a single canonical static source of truth. What we have to do is continuously adapt. We have to adapt the laws to meet the risks that develop every single day. We have to adapt tooling and training on the privacy security side to implement control of those risks. And we have to keep educating the engineers and the attorneys to make sure that they are working in a very efficient fashion. So all three things happening at the same time means that that collaborative process, that trust, and that enforcement and the learning and the discussion, that to me is the canonical source of truth. And in its very nature, it's going to keep evolving. So if you want a single source of truth, yes, there are multiple sources of truth, but they will continuously evolve. So I would encourage being as broad as possible and being as open as possible to multiple sources at the same time.
Yeah, a question from Sumetha. If from all the tools you've used, from all the privacy tools, security tools you have used, like what's missing as a privacy engineer, a director of privacy engineering? Like, if you have the magic wand or
Yeah.
magic stick, like what would you love the industry to build?
What is missing is a standard. Like, when you, so I live in California in the US. I file tax forms in two states, in Oregon, where I have a home, in California, where I work, and in the US, which is the national federal tax, right? So there is a clear path on what counts as enforcement. It is not pleasant because our taxes are pretty high in California here. The tax software is not the easiest to use. So, but at the same time, there I know exactly where the process starts and I know where the process ends. And that is for tax law that doesn't change nearly as much as the privacy landscape changes. So what is missing is a reference material. So I built my training materials on LinkedIn. I built the data protocol certification. I wrote the book to get the conversation started and make sure that people understand that there is a place to start. I often have conversations like these with regulators. I often have conversations like these with boards of Fortune 500 companies. And these are companies that have a public posture that says, we are awesome at security and privacy. But behind the scenes, they're extremely scared because they don't know where to start. They don't know how to measure success, and they don't know how to prepare for risk. So for me, having that education would be pretty critical. And this would mean people teaching privacy and security in schools, but teaching privacy and security not just to privacy security domain experts, but to engineers who are afraid that if they don't do it right, their tool will never see the light of day, or they'll have a bad headline 2 years down the road that will destroy their career. So I wrote all these training. I'm happy to send those links. Mehdi, I'm sure you have some of those in my bio. If you can see some questions about where do we find these resources. I think having accepted sources of training and truth would be pretty critical. I think I have every confidence from that point forward that attorneys and engineers at multiple companies can use my trainings as a baseline and then build their strategy in a way that makes sense for their company. But I think the absence of a canonical starting point is pretty frustrating for me, and I didn't have that. And when I was learning all of this 7, 8, 9 years ago, I had nowhere to go to. So I had to build all these things not just based on my learnings and successes, but based on my failures as well. So in those materials, I have talked about things I have done in the past that have not worked as well. So, and for people that have bought my trainings and books, they tell me that they have learned as much from my failures that they have learned from my successes. So I feel having those reference points disseminate and be adapted widely would be pretty satisfying for me. And not just because I wrote them, but because this is not being taught at any level in a way that will meaningfully help engineers start out.
Yeah, we're a little bit over time from what we allocated, but we have another question if you allow us.
That's
Are
fine.
you familiar with the data privacy vocabulary, the DPV? They try to be kind of the standard for privacy vocabulary and practice.
I am not an expert in it, but I'm familiar with it. Yes.
And so, but you so far you've considered that it's not the standard you were expecting. With
It is not the standard I'm expecting, in the sense where you can't take it and then implement something with it and measure privacy security risk and enforce controls and also sell to the board of directors the need for funding, right? For me, a good reference point would be connecting the different parts of the company that historically don't talk to each other. That's number one. Being able to implement tools that are enforceable and measurable and deterministic. And C, being able to map all of this to an enforcement regime like the GDPR, CCPA. All three need to be present because this is an extremely expensive endeavor. So my goal is going to be to make it as cheap, as efficient, and as business overlapping as possible, and ensure that the end result augments not just your privacy posture, but also the company's ability to run soundly, securely, and profitably as a business. So I feel like every resource you've mentioned here so far, Mehdi, is a great reference point. But I think the computing processing power that has grown has far outpaced the moral or regulatory processing power. So I feel in that sense, the trainings I've built are a lot more practical because I want engineers, attorneys, and everybody in between to be able to take those learnings and immediately apply them. Because when you apply them, that's when you start learning what it's going to take for your business to really scale in a meaningful fashion. So that'd be my response to that question.
so it seems a great opportunity, for a regular engineer to learn about privacy and become privacy engineer for a career path or
Absolutely, absolutely. And I tell people privacy is like the Trojan horse. If you build the domain knowledge in privacy, you will learn not just privacy techniques, but you will learn how the tech stack works end to end. You will understand how your data storage works end to end, how machine learning works, how risk works, how security teams operate. And that knowledge will help you build better platforms for misinformation prevention, harassment and bullying prevention, overall security, data quality, right? And there are any number of domains that you can build expertise in that are not taught in college that you can learn because of privacy, right? So I think of privacy as a starting point. So this is a great career move. So I tell people right now, we are going through a tough economy right now. Headcounts are hard to get. OPEX and CAPEX budgets are hard to get. So if you invest in privacy, you are doing two things. You're helping your business become more secure, and you're helping grow your own skills. So I would strongly recommend. In fact, I was an extremely average engineer when I wrote code. I was not the best coder. I was not the best product manager. And yet today I have a book out, I have publications out, I have podcasts out, and there are people who are a lot smarter than me who often reach out to me for advice. And I'm just being very honest about this simply because there are a lot of average engineers out there for whom this could be an amazing boost. The Nishants of the future who might be even better than I am. So if this is where I am in my career right now because of privacy, think about what you could accomplish because you have a lot more awareness and you don't have the mistakes on your resume that I do from like 10 years of learning.
Maybe really last one, but Hannah in the chat is asking really about like end user privacy. How much the end users, you've been at Netflix, which is B2C company like Uber, Google, really, there is an end user, there's always an end user at the end, right? But like how much these are important to push company to adopt better privacy practice. Like it will be a balance between the internal engineers and lawyers, the board of directors, but also the customers, right? So how we can find the right balance between all of this pressuring for better privacy engineering.
So I tell people you start with the New York Times, you end with the Wall Street Journal. And what I mean by that is, how would you like if something you're doing was in the front page of the New York Times tomorrow? Okay. And that's a great conversation starter. But at some point, people get tired of the moral virtue signaling and they need a way to make the case for it that is a lot more deterministic. So that brings me to the Wall Street Journal test, which is how would you like it if this risk blows up in your face? The business has all these regulations to essentially abide by, a consent decree that is extremely punitive, and your share prices drop. We are in this space where the privacy, security, compliance, regulation changes can happen, not just via regulatory fiat, but via companies like Apple, for example, right? So my job is to tell the engineers within the company, we have to protect the external customer, but we also have to protect our business. So how do you identify risks that are common to both? How do you identify fixes that could help both? And how do you get started? So my fundamental belief is if you start something and if it catches on and if people see you as an actor in good faith, things pretty much take off from there. And I've had my share of successes, I've had my share of failures. But in general, if you look at the programs that existed before I took over, again, at Nike, at Netflix, at Google, at Uber, the before and after success story speaks for itself. If you look at, we've had our challenges at Uber 3-4 years ago. Our privacy story has improved dramatically since then. And all you got to do in the beginning is just start that conversation. And if people tell you this cannot be done, show them my book and my resume. Because if you can improve these 4 programs over the span of a decade, you can improve pretty much any privacy security program out there and present all of these priorities at the same time. But again, use automation, use the shared training to make the case, find anecdotes, present to the board of director those anecdotes and the metrics, and you will be on your way. I cannot guarantee you will win every single argument, but you will win enough to demonstrate that you are moving in the right direction.
Yep. Johan is asking the last one. You can answer yes or no. Have you been using anonymized synthetic data, typically for machine learning training, or even privacy enhancing technologies?
Absolutely. So this is a hard question to answer in a constrained time frame, but you have to anonymize data in a way that is measurable. How do you, on the one side, measure risk identification of k-anonymity, L diversity? On the other side, how do you make sure the anonymization techniques actually work and also can be used? So this is something I think of anonymization not as an isolated, separate, bespoke technology, but I think of it as an obfuscation strategy, as a right to be forgotten option, as a way to protect data when access control channels often fail. So yes is the answer to your question, but there's a lot more to it, and there'll be different anonymization techniques, different ways to anonymize data, different ways to measure success, and different ways to scale anonymization across different locations. Like in some cases, you might have to delete the data completely. In some cases, you can encrypt but not anonymize. In some cases, you can neither delete nor encrypt. Anonymization is your only get out of jail card. So yes, and it depends on the best way to answer your question.
Thank you very much, Nishant. We don't want to take too much of your time, and we will send all the resources. Thank you also for all the knowledge you share, to help people to increase their privacy engineering skills. We will share the link to the book on mining on Amazon, to your free LinkedIn classes, and also to the class you give on data protocol for the privacy engineering certification. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for all your questions, and don't hesitate. Some people are asking for your contact, so I will not ask here to share your privacy.
You can find me on LinkedIn. So by the way, I think maybe I share my LinkedIn info with you, so you can just people contact me on LinkedIn all the time. I mean, it may take me a day or two to respond because I get a lot of messages, but feel free to reach out to me. Happy to keep the conversation going. And I'm also always looking for good engineers, so maybe that conversation could go other places as well. So yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. And again, we will send all the infos and the wrap up and the video for to everyone, and also the people who signed up and didn't show up. And we will see each other for a second talk on privacy engineering. So yeah, thank you very much, Nishant, for being there with us, and thank you all, and see you in 2 weeks for the next one.
But I think that Hannah's thinking for another question. Do we want to?
Yeah, Hannah is asking some question, like, but it was mostly about your email. If you have a website, LinkedIn site, so we will send all of this.
Yeah, absolutely, and happy to connect there as well.
Yeah, we will send it to everyone.
Thank you. This was a great experience. Thank you so much. I enjoyed the call. This is one of the best sessions I've had in a long time. Very, very good questions.
Oh, thank you very much. But again, this is the privacy engineering communities we're gathering all over the world. So yeah, you will always be welcome to share knowledge there.
Name your time and place. I'll be there.
Yeah, perfect, Nishant. Have a good one, everyone.
Take care. Have a good week.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good evening.